topic is the impact on COVID on immigrants and non-migrants abroad. So with that, we have seen a lot of changes that how the business would be affected with the restrictions on the travel for their employees who are working abroad or joining from abroad for their teams here in the US. So with that, we can actually look into the general travel restrictions that we have currently in place, that because of the negative COVID-19 test is required for people traveling to the US. That includes US citizens and non-citizens too, that if anyone traveling from abroad to join or to enter the US would require a negative COVID report, and which has to be valid, at least taken within 3 days prior to the departure uh, coming to the US. So, and required for all passengers who are 2 years of age or older. It's not required for infants less than 2 years. But otherwise, there are some countries which also require to have a 14-day quarantine period. That means if you are traveling from the US or going abroad to work at a branch or a subsidiary or with a client or a vendor who is abroad, for example, in Philippines, in Africa, or in India, or in Asia, or any place, that there are certain requirements for you to follow, that you have to be quarantined for 14 days upon arrival into those countries. Again, there is no quarantine requirement for people who are traveling into the US. It's only the negative COVID test which is required, but otherwise there is no quarantine requirement for the US, but there might be some requirements abroad. So that you need to be mindful of, and maybe check before you travel, because that might disrupt your business plans, because that's a requirement for you to be quarantined and cannot be with your teams. And check the US Department of State website prior to travel, because there are certain warnings or notices which periodically that US Department of State alerts the US citizens before we travel. So that's an important piece that I would actually look into when somebody is traveling, because that has a comprehensive information about the situation on the ground, which might actually help you make your travel plans. Then always check with the airlines for specific requirements. Again, there are specific airlines which has certain requirements for you to follow based on where they origin from, or otherwise where the layover or the stopovers would be. So that is another requirement that probably you have to be mindful, meticulously check with the airlines regarding these plans, and especially with the negative COVID tests and other requirements. So these are the general requirements I think everyone should be aware of. But otherwise, these are the general guidelines that I would always recommend the clients or the HR or mobility teams to focus on before they allow their employees or resources to travel abroad, or even to travel to come back to the US. Then there are certain geographic travel suspensions that we have noticed this time and again. Again, this is the second time that we have noticed these kind of restrictions, that people from certain countries are not allowed to travel. Again, the exceptions being US citizens and green card holders, that is legal permanent residents. But otherwise, there are vast restrictions on non-immigrants to travel to the US from certain countries like Brazil, China, India, Iran, and I have just put the slide on. You can actually go over the list of countries. And this list is changing, that sometimes the Department of State, or maybe based on some exceptions, these things can be changed. But the presidential order would actually restrict people to travel from these countries to the United States because of the ongoing pandemic situation in those countries. So anyone traveling from these countries should actually follow the guidelines to make sure if they fall under any of the exceptions. But otherwise, the US citizens and the green card holders are allowed to travel without any restrictions. The only requirement for them would be to have a negative COVID test before they arrive to the US, and that has to be taken 3 days prior to their travel. With that, we can actually look into the exceptions. That's an interesting aspect. So how would this help us? Or otherwise, how would this help the businesses to work around to see if there are any exceptions applicable for them, so that there is continuity in their business? Because I have seen many businesses are getting impacted because of these travel restrictions, and they are actually seeking alternative ways of continue to have their resources work or get connected with the teams if they are working, especially in the US. So, as I mentioned earlier, the general exceptions being US citizens and US nationals, they are allowed to travel with the negative COVID test, of course, but otherwise there is no restriction. And the similar way, it's legal permanent residents, that is green card holders who are allowed to travel to the US without any restrictions. Then there are few categories of non-citizens who are also allowed to travel, and as long as they are married, a non-citizen getting married to a US citizen, and if they have any other document for them to travel, then they would be allowed to travel. And for example, this is a great avenue that I have seen for the employees who are working here on H1, L1, or any other visa types. Because if they are on a non-immigrant visa and they have the children born in the US who are US citizens and who are less than 21 years of age, and they are US citizens who are allowed to travel. So all they have to carry is their birth certificate, and even a H1B holder, a visa holder, would be able to travel under this exception. And that is similar for L1 or any other non-immigrant categories. And sometimes it so happens that if there is an L1 or a H1 visa holder who is working here on a non-immigrant visa, then he has one child who is a US citizen, but there might be another child who was not born here, who might be an elder child who was born in their home country. Even that elder child, the sibling of the US citizen, would be allowed to travel along with the family. So the whole intention, as it always been, that family reunion is the highest priority for the US immigration. So the exception also I have seen, I have noticed that they address those priorities. So US citizens who are born here would be allowed to travel at the same time their parents and siblings would be allowed to travel, as long as they are minor, they are less than 21 years of their age, and accompanying with the documentation. So with those kind of exceptions, I think there's a huge majority of the people that they would be willing to travel or has an options to travel. So that is something that on a case by case basis, we can evaluate and see if they fall under any of these general exceptions, because these general exceptions spell out based on they getting related or married or in a way with a US citizen. That's how these general exceptions come into play. Then there are some specific exceptions, that is for geographic travel suspensions, those invited to the US to contain or mitigate COVID. So if there is a research, an ongoing research, and they have invited, there is a hospital or a research organization or the government is actually inviting someone to come to the US to participate or contribute on the COVID and the mitigation of the COVID, probably they are allowed, and there are specific documentation and exceptions allowed for them. And the same way, air or sea crew members, if someone is flying in, or the crew members of a ship, they are allowed to travel to the US. And of course, foreign government officials who are immediate family members on any of these visa categories, A1, A2, C2, C3, G1, G2, they're also allowed to travel to the US. And of course, because they are on government mission, and to have this uninterrupted way of communications and coordinations with various governments, they fall under that exception. Then, of course, the members of US armed forces, their spouses and children are allowed if they're coming back from a posting. Then the similar way law enforcement efforts are per Secretary of State or Homeland Security or an Attorney General's notifications that they actually allow certain categories of people to travel in the interest of the US, then those people are allowed. And the national interest for the Secretary of State and Homeland Security or their designates is what we call them. So again, these are all specific, not general, and it is in the best interest of the US. Then the national interest exception. This is the area where probably we get a lot of questions, and we have seen people coming back saying that, hey, would I qualify, or my company qualifies, because these are critical resources that we have, and there is a business a disruption because of their travel restrictions. Then yes, it is allowed. But we have to go through the process and check if we meet those criteria, even to fall under the national interest exception. So humanitarian travel, public health, national security, these are the exceptions. And humanitarian travel, if someone is sick here, a family member or someone, and a non-immigrant or an immediate family member who is abroad wants to travel to the US to help or to give assistance or to take care of anything, probably they are allowed. But again, that needs documentation and contacting the consulate abroad and the home countries to get those exceptions, to get a letter or permission to travel that is required by the airlines. And I have seen that there are some airlines who are also participating in the webinars. So they need to have specific procedures in place that what kind of documentation is accepted, and we can always help the companies, the corporations, airlines, or any other corporation to have these kind of things in place so that they actually meet this government criteria. At the same time, there are no hurdles at the port of entry with Customs and Borders Protections or Department of Homeland Security. Then, of course, pilots and aircrew for training and aircrafts as needed. Then journalists, students, and certain academics under exchange visitors programs are allowed. And the great thing that I have seen, notice is that we are now, there would be a lot of new students coming into the country to start on the semesters beginning in August. So there is an exception for them. So as long as they have secured a visa, on F1 visa or an M1 visa or a J1 visa, they're allowed to travel to the US without any national interest exception letters from the consulate. They can simply travel because these are exempted. And as long as the program is starting in August, they should be able to do it. And they can come here 30 days prior to the start date of their programs. That's a great benefit for whoever is aspiring to study here in the US, because there is no travel restrictions on those kind of conditions. And vital support for critical infrastructure sectors. This is a broad category where the national interest exception is allowed or is applicable. So vital support of critical infrastructure sectors, again, in the notification, they have actually given several sectors, several corporations or several industries which fall under this infrastructure. There's chemical, commercial facilities, communications, healthcare and public information technology, and several things that I have put it in the slide. But again, we have to show that they will not be able to do their job remotely, and their physical presence is required based on the nature of their job or the nature of their project they are participating in. So that needs documentation, and we are already working with corporations, several corporations, in fact, in actually putting these documents together and trying to guide them and see if they actually fall under one of these exceptions. And we can help them follow the process to apply to the consulate, send the communications to the consulate, and wait until get their travel approvals. Then it has to be documented to meet the criteria that has been carved out in the interest of the United States. So proving the vital support, how do we prove it? So services, we have to prove that the services necessary for the continued existence in the US, and then physical presence is required. We cannot just bypass that, because that's a typical question that we might get from the consulates, from the body which is actually reviewing these documents, might actually come back and say, hey, this job can be done remotely. And especially that is true for any IT related jobs. So there is no reason why you should be traveling to the US. And unless it's specifically presented and you reason out why their physical presence is important for continuing the project, then that would actually eventually be a support to one of these infrastructure organizations that we mentioned about. Then, uh, unlikely the senior executives and managers will qualify because activities are not typically considered vital. That is what it is. But senior executives and managers, they could be able to manage things unless, again, they fall under that exception saying that their services are necessary for continuation of the business or the business units or the projects here. And the physical presence cannot be replaced working remotely. So these are the things that we need to look into the details, but the strong documentation is what it is. Because my experience, we have a few clients who submitted this documentation and contacted the consulate, but it's been more than a few days that we haven't heard back yet. So there is a backlog even in those processes. So sooner the better, as long as you anticipate that there would be a business disruption or would be a problem for the continuance of any project because of the absence of a critical resource. So this is the time for the teams to get together, discuss. It could be a mobility team, your legal team, or a HR team, or project managers could raise this and try to actually bring the topics so that uh, we can also help in documenting. And because this process is unpredictable at this point, we don't know how long will it take, and it's case by case basis. So I think the priority would be for government agencies, research organizations, hospitals in falling under this category to be given a preference. And of course, it could be also as first come, first serve, and based on the capacity that they can actually process this kind of request at any consulate, because most of the consulates does not have the personnel to fully function and process these kind of requests. So that being critical, then check with the applicable US consulates for the procedures, because each consulate that we have noticed that is following a different procedure. But a general approach would be to send an email to the consular officer describing the issue and maybe providing the documentation. We can help you with that too. Then if the resource does not have a visa before they have to apply and travel, and also another step is to request for an emergency appointment, and the emergency appointment criteria would be different for each consulate and based on their priorities, and of course the factors that you mentioned for a national interest exception under critical infrastructure would also be possible that helping you to get an immediate emergency appointment. So uh, then a national interest exception for students, then this is students subject to geographic COVID travel restriction may qualify then if their academic semester begins by August 1st or later. That's what we discussed. And so this is not applicable for any of those countries. The students from any of those countries who are generally restricted to travel to the United States. And students with valid F1 and M1 visas and academic programs do not need to apply for NIE to travel. Their visa is sufficient. The visa category itself is an exception, so they can freely travel, and they can travel 30 days prior to the start date of their programs. Then US consulate and embassy closures, that's an important aspect that many embassies and consulates are closed. But as I said, if there is a reason that you believe that these people or the resources would qualify for an emergency exception, a national interest exception, then probably they also might be considered for an emergency visa. So that's something that you can look into and maybe contact the consulate, but be mindful that most of the consulates and embassies are closed. So only emergency appointments are available, not the general appointments would be available for people until things get better. So check the websites, check our news. We keep on updating our website frequently, quite frequently actually. So you can actually follow us on any of the social media. We post good news there, so alerts which are useful for the business community and especially for the travel and other things. So that being said, I think I would give it to Julia for the second part. You can.
All right. Thank you, Praveen, and thank you to Dorothy for the introduction. So I'm going to just share my screen now.